The chipped formica of the desk felt slick under my palms, even through the thin latex gloves they'd left in a dispenser next to the time clock. Not a great sign already. Usually places like this don't bother with gloves, especially for a security gig. But I needed the job, and the gloves weren't going to argue with the medical bills. What bothered me more was the note taped to the monitor of the ancient computer. Just a single line, typed in a font that looked like it came standard with Windows 95. Keys are with Cal, don't ask. Don't ask. Like that was normal, like Cal wasn't supposed to just hand over the keys, like there was some unspoken history there. I glanced around the tiny office, a box really, jammed into the corner of the main hall. The flea market itself was cavernous, a repurposed warehouse with a corrugated iron roof. It smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot. Not a pleasant combination. Rows and rows of stalls stretched out before me, mostly covered with tarps at this hour. Friday nights were the overnight vendors, the ones selling stuff they probably shouldn't be, or stuff nobody else wanted. The air hummed with the low thrum of the building's ancient HVAC system, and every few minutes, a distant forklift whined as someone moved pallets around in the back. I found Cal near the front, leaning against a stall overflowing with porcelain dolls. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Dark circles under his eyes, a 5 o'clock shadow that was more like a 3-day growth. He just wordlessly tossed me a ring of keys, the metal cold against my skin, and mumbled, "Have a good one." Then he practically sprinted out the door, not even bothering with a goodbye. No explanation. No orientation. Just go. On the desk, next to the time clock, was a sealed manila envelope with my name typed on it, Kieran O'Connell. It felt prepared, like they were expecting me. Inside, a few sheets of paper, stapled together, rules. The first one read, "If a phone rings on the premises after 11 p.m., do not answer it. Let it ring. If it stops and immediately starts again, leave the area. 11 p.m. It was already 10:45. An odd rule. Probably some prank from a previous guard. People like to mess with the new guy. I pictured some bored teenager wiring up a phone to repeatedly ring just to see someone jump. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it wasn't exactly terrifying either. The next one. If asked directly whether you have seen or heard anything unusual, say no. Do not qualify, hedge, or describe what you saw. Just know. That one was weirder. A little unsettling. What kind of stuff went on here that someone needed to explicitly instruct you to lie about it? Probably insurance fraud, I figured. People trying to scam the market owner. I'd worked enough odd jobs to know that people were always trying to pull something. Do not ask the outgoing shift why they look the way they look. Take the keys, say the departure phrase, begin your shift. Okay, now someone was just messing with me. Cal's face had been a picture, and I'd almost asked him if he was all right. Good thing I hadn't. The departure phrase. What departure phrase? Do not bring any items that are yellow onto the premises. This includes clothing, accessories, food packaging, or personal items. Seriously? Yellow? I didn't even own anything particularly yellow. It felt arbitrary, almost superstitious, like someone had a phobia. It was ridiculous. The list went on. If someone addresses you as if they know you but you do not recognize them, do not confirm or deny how you know them. Treat the interaction as a case of mistaken identity and disengage politely. If a resident or patient makes the same specific complaint 3 shifts in a row, not a variation, the exact same complaint, escalate to the supervisor rather than addressing it yourself. Residents? Patients? This was a flea market, not a hospital. If a room feels noticeably colder than the adjacent rooms, not drafty, just cold, do not enter alone. Return with another person or leave it for the next shift. That one gave me a little pause. I'm always cold. Always have been. But it was probably just old building syndrome, bad insulation, or something. If you hear breathing that is not your own in an empty room, do not hold your breath. Breathe normally and leave at a normal pace. That was unsettling. I ran that one over in my head a few times. It didn't make any sense, but again, probably just a joke. The last one. If the basement door is found unlocked at shift start, lock it without opening it to check inside. Log that it was found unlocked. Do not investigate why. A basement? I hadn't even noticed a basement. I folded the papers and shoved them into my jacket pocket. Honestly, the whole thing was absurd. Eccentric maybe, but harmless. I glanced at the clock. 10:58. I walked the perimeter of the main hall, checking the emergency exits, making sure the tarps were secure. The sweet, rotting smell seemed stronger now, almost cloying. I found the basement door tucked away behind a row of antique furniture. It was steel, heavy, and unlocked. I didn't open it. I locked it. Locked it in the flimsy notebook they'd left on the desk. Basement door found unlocked at 11:03 p.m. Secured. The act felt strangely final, like completing a checklist for something I didn't understand. I walked back to the desk, the keys jangling in my hand, and sat down. The hum of the HVAC seemed louder now, and the porcelain dolls in the distance seemed to be watching me. I pulled out my phone to call Sarah, but then I paused. The air felt heavy, still. I set the phone down on the desk, face up, and suddenly I noticed the screensaver, a single vibrant yellow sunflower. I started by checking the power strips. Old place, lots of vendors setting up and tearing down, constantly plugging and unplugging things. Tripped breakers were a regular thing, and Cal hadn't bothered to leave any notes about which ones controlled what. Just check the perimeter and observe. Easy for him to say I had to figure out where the coffee maker was plugged in if I wanted a second cup. The main hall smelled less sweet now, more like dust and old cardboard. I walked slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, testing each outlet. Most were dead, but I found one powering a small space heater tucked behind a booth selling vintage lunchboxes. That explained the slightly warmer air in that corner. I made a mental note to check it again later, make sure nobody was running something unsafe. Sarah would kill me if someone burned the place down on my watch, not because of the job, but because of the financial repercussions. We couldn't afford a lawsuit. I worked my way towards the back, past the rows of stalls draped with canvas tarps. Everything looked settled, quiet, too quiet, maybe. I kept expecting to hear a rustle, a cough, something to break the stillness. It was unsettling, but not in a scary way, just empty. I checked the emergency exit there, made sure the alarm hadn't been tampered with. Everything was as it should be. By the time I reached the front desk again, it was almost 11:30. I hadn't found the coffee maker, and honestly, I was losing the urge. My stomach was churning a little, not from hunger, but from a kind of low-grade anxiety. This place just felt wrong. I sat down, intending to make another pass around the perimeter, but my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "How's it going? Everything okay?" I started to type back, slow, quiet, weird, but okay, when the landline on the desk started to ring. A shrill, old-fashioned ring that echoed in the empty hall. I glanced at the phone, then back at my own. Sarah was waiting. I could just ignore it. It was probably a wrong number or someone messing around. But then I remembered the papers, the rules, something about phones. I vaguely recalled a warning, something about not answering after a certain hour. I couldn't remember the exact wording, but the gist was there. Don't answer. It felt foolish, paranoid even. It was just a phone, but Cal had looked so disturbed, and the list, it was all so specific. The phone rang again, and then it stopped. Silence for maybe 2 seconds. Then it started again. Immediately before the silence had fully registered. Ring, ring, ring. I stood up so fast my chair almost tipped over. The feeling in my stomach wasn't anxiety anymore. It was a cold, hollow dread. I didn't analyze it, didn't try to rationalize it. The rules, however ridiculous, felt insistent. I turned and walked away from the desk, moving quickly towards the back of the hall, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that ringing phone. It kept ringing as I walked, a relentless, insistent sound that followed me into the shadows. I found myself by the antique furniture near the basement door. I didn't stop there, just kept walking, pushing past a display of porcelain dolls, their painted eyes seeming to swivel in my direction. I needed to be away. Finally, I reached the furthest emergency exit, the one overlooking the loading dock. I leaned against the cold metal door, breathing heavily, listening. The ringing had faded, but it still echoed in my mind. I pulled out my phone again, intending to call Sarah and explain why I hadn't answered. I unlocked the screen. No new messages, and then I saw the time. 11:57 p.m. Sarah's treatment session ended at 11. She always calls me right after. Every single time I tried dialing her number, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail, a knot tightened in my chest. Something was wrong. She always calls. And I'd ignored the chance to check, to reassure her, because of a ringing phone and a list of absurd rules. I started making my way around the perimeter again, trying to focus on the practical, checking the locks on the loading bay doors, making sure the emergency exits weren't blocked. It was mostly just a visual sweep, honestly. These doors hadn't been forced in years, probably. The whole place felt secure, in a forgotten kind of way. Like nobody even remembered it was here, let alone thought to break into it. The air in the back was colder, even for a concrete building in November. It smelled like dust and old cardboard, with a faint undercurrent of something sweet, almost floral. I couldn't place it. It wasn't unpleasant, just odd. I paused by a stack of antique radios, fiddling with the dial on one. Static crackled, then a burst of a big band tune. I quickly switched it off. Too much noise, too much life in this place. I moved past the furniture section, the porcelain dolls still watching, and into the aisle of vintage clothing. That's when I saw Weston. He was leaning against a rack of coats, looking even more exhausted than I felt. He usually handled the midday shift, but he'd traded with someone to cover a few hours tonight. Said he needed the overtime. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice rough. He hadn't made eye contact yet. "Yeah, fine," I said. "Quiet? A little too quiet, maybe." He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "You notice anything strange?" The question hung in the air. Strange. That was a loaded word. The rules flashed through my mind, fragments of warnings about things being seen, about descriptions. I remembered Cal's face, tight and pale, when he'd handed me the list. It felt ridiculous to even consider it. Weston was just making conversation. He probably meant, had I seen any shoplifters, anything out of the ordinary. "No," I said, a little too quickly. "Just quiet. Really quiet." The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. Weston didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. It wasn't suspicion, exactly, more like assessment. It made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. I shifted my weight, suddenly acutely aware of the dampness in the air, the smell of dust and something floral. He cleared his throat. "Right. Well, just checking. Been a weird week. Lots of energy in the air, you know?" I nodded, wanting to end the conversation. I felt like I'd already said too much, even though I hadn't said anything at all. "Yeah, I get it." He pushed himself off the rack and started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "You new here, right? Never seen you around?" "First week," I said. "Just trying to keep things secure." "Good," he said. And then, without another word, he walked towards the front of the hall, disappearing between the rows of stalls. I stood there for a moment watching him go. My heart was doing that weird fluttering thing again, not exactly fear, but a kind of anxious vibration in my chest. It was probably just the lack of coffee, and the stress about Sarah, and the unsettling vibe of the place. It was all adding up. I needed to finish my patrol, get to the end of the shift, and go home. I turned to continue my walk, and that's when I saw it, a small yellow sunflower lying on the floor near the rack of vintage coats. It hadn't been there a minute ago. I was certain of it. It seemed out of place, violently so, like a splash of color in a monochrome world. I knew, with a sickening certainty, the rules again, fragments rising to the surface. Flowers weren't allowed, something about bringing the outside in. The memory was hazy, but the feeling was sharp and cold. I didn't bend down to pick it up. I didn't even get close. I just turned and walked in the opposite direction towards the loading dock, needing to be somewhere else, anywhere else. I had a feeling, a growing dread, that if I looked at that flower for 1 second longer, something would change, something irreversible. I quickened my pace, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hall. I needed to find Cal's logbook and write down the time, my location, the fact that Weston asked if I'd noticed anything strange, just a record. A small, insignificant detail, but the thought of writing it, of putting it into words, felt wrong. I knew somehow that once it was written, it would be real. And I wasn't sure I wanted to make it real. I kept walking. The image of the yellow sunflower burned into the back of my mind. I was restocking the first aid kits. It felt productive. A small win against the general feeling of helplessness that had settled over me since taking this job. Cal had left a supply closet stocked with everything you could imagine. Bandages, antiseptic wipes, burn cream, even those little instant ice packs. I was methodically checking expiration dates, pulling out anything past its prime, and making a list of what needed replacing. It was quiet, thankfully. No ringing phones, no unsettling questions from Weston. Just the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the rustle of plastic as I sorted through the supplies. The kits themselves were a bit ridiculous, honestly. Oversized, bright orange plastic boxes with enough stuff in them to treat a small battlefield. This wasn't a factory floor. It was a flea market. Most injuries were probably splinters and minor scrapes, but I figured it was better to be prepared. Sarah always said I worried too much. It was a comfort to think about her, to picture her face, even though I knew she was probably exhausted after another round of treatment. I'd check in with her again later, after my break. I was almost finished when I heard footsteps approaching. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not like Weston's, which were quick and purposeful, these were hesitant. I straightened up, smoothed down my jacket, and turned to see Cal standing in the doorway. He looked worse. His face was pale, almost gray, and his hands were clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles white. He was shivering, despite the fact that the closet was warm. He held out a ring of keys. It felt cold in my hand, heavier than it should have been. I glanced up at him, trying to read his expression, but his face was blank, almost vacant. He just stared straight ahead, avoiding my gaze. I remembered the rule from the document, something about not asking why they looked the way they did. Just take the keys, say the phrase, and begin the shift. It seemed cruel, but that was the whole tenor of the document, wasn't it? Utterly arbitrary instructions, devoid of explanation. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he had a bad day. Maybe he'd just seen a ghost. It was a ridiculous place, after all. A cavernous space filled with forgotten things, and who knew what else. I took a deep breath and forced myself to meet his eyes, then immediately looked away. I didn't want to see whatever was behind that empty stare. "Have a good one," I said, reciting the departure phrase exactly as Cal had said it to me on Friday. It felt hollow, meaningless, like a script I was forced to perform. He didn't respond. He just nodded slowly, turned, and walked away. He didn't walk out, though. He walked through the loading dock doors, the same ones I'd checked and locked 1 hour ago. He didn't open them, didn't touch the handles. He just stepped into the solid metal. I blinked, certain I'd imagined it. Must have been the fatigue, the stress. I rubbed my eyes, looked back at the loading dock, and it was just a wall of corrugated steel. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still gripping the keys. The air in the supply closet felt suddenly cold, and a faint floral scent drifted in. Not like yellow sunflowers, but something heavier, cloying, like lilies in a closed room. I checked the lock on the closet door, then carefully rechecked it. It was secure. I finished restocking the first aid kits, but I couldn't shake the image of Cal walking through the wall. I logged the shift change, noting the time, but deliberately omitting any mention of what I'd seen. I didn't want to write it down to make it real. I didn't want to trigger whatever that was. I needed to focus on the patrol, to stick to the routine, to pretend that everything was normal, but it wasn't. It hadn't been normal since the beginning, and now it felt like it was getting worse. I left the supply closet and headed back towards the main hall, the keys digging into my palm. I felt a cold spot on the back of my neck, like someone was breathing down it, even though I was alone. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, telling myself it was the draft, the old building settling, telling myself it was nothing, but I knew with a growing sense of dread that it was something, and whatever it was watching me. I started with the booths closest to the loading dock. It was mostly furniture in that section, old dressers and chip tables covered in plastic sheeting. The air smelled like dust and mothballs, a smell that clung to the back of your throat. It wasn't a pleasant smell, but it was familiar, It was the smell of the flea market. I used my flashlight to scan under the tables, checking for anything out of place. Mostly it was just cardboard boxes and discarded price tags. I'd brought coffee with me, a large travel mug filled with the dark roast my wife, Sarah, preferred. She makes it every morning before her appointments, making enough for both of us. It's one of the small things that feels normal, even now. I took a sip, the heat warming my hands. It was lukewarm already, of course. I'd been walking for nearly an hour. The booths were spaced far enough apart that you could see the concrete floor between them. The shadows stretched long and distorted in the beam of my flashlight. It was quiet, eerily so. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional creak of the building settling. I checked the fire extinguishers, making sure they were still charged. Routine stuff. The kind of stuff that keeps you busy, keeps your mind from wandering. I reached Section C, mostly antiques and collectibles. A lot of chipped porcelain dolls and tarnished silver, old radios and record players. I paused at a booth overflowing with vintage postcards, carefully arranged in plastic sleeves. It was oddly comforting, seeing these little snapshots of a different time. A time when things felt simpler, maybe. I was looking at one of a boardwalk, bright colors and laughing faces, when I noticed it. My mug. It was bright yellow, a ridiculous sunshine yellow. Sarah picked it out for me, saying it would cheer me up. It wasn't my color, not even close. I usually drink out of a plain ceramic mug, dark blue. But Sarah had insisted, and now standing here in the gloom of the flea market, that yellow felt wrong. I remembered a fragment of the document. Something about colors. Something about not bringing certain colors onto the premises. It wasn't clear, exactly. I'd skimmed through it so quickly, trying to memorize the key points. Something about a signal, about attracting attention. It felt less like instructions and more like a list of things not to do, a litany of prohibitions. I couldn't recall the specific color, but the feeling of dread was immediate and intense. It wasn't the logical fear of getting in trouble. It was something deeper, something primal. I told myself it was ridiculous, just a coffee mug. It wasn't going to summon any demons or attract any unwanted attention. I was letting my anxiety get the better of me. It had been a stressful week, with Sarah's treatment and the bills piling up. I needed to calm down. It was just a color. But the image of Cal's face, pale and vacant, flashed in my mind. The way he'd handed over the keys without a word. And something about the floral scent, too heavy, too sweet. It all felt connected somehow. Without thinking, I quickly unzipped my backpack and slipped the mug inside, burying it under my jacket. The plastic felt cold against my hand. It was a clumsy movement, and I almost knocked over a stack of old vinyl records. I straightened them hastily, then continued my patrol. The silence felt heavier now. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by a person, but by the space itself. I passed a row of booths selling old tools, rusted wrenches and chipped hammers. A single bare bulb flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows. I kept my flashlight trained on the floor in front of me, avoiding eye contact with anything. I reached the end of Section C, and then turned into the long corridor that led to the back of the building. A door stood slightly ajar at the end of the corridor, a door I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't on the map I'd been given. It was a plain wooden door painted a faded gray. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over my radio. Should I check it? Report it? But the document hadn't mentioned any hidden doors, and the rule about not asking questions. The rule about just doing the job. I kept walking. I didn't look at the door. I didn't slow down. I just kept walking. My flashlight beam fixed on the floor, the yellow mug pressing against my back, a silent weight in my backpack. The air grew colder, and the smell of mothballs was replaced by something else, something faint and metallic, something I couldn't quite place. But it was there, and I knew with a certainty that sent a shiver down my spine that whatever was behind that door was waiting, and it knew I was there. I was checking the fire extinguishers. It felt productive, something to do with a clear purpose. Section B had 3, all green and looking recently inspected. I pulled the pins on each, gave a quick squeeze of the lever, just to make sure the pressure was good. Each one hissed obligingly, spraying a cloud of white powder for a split second before I released it again. It coated everything in a fine film. The booths, the dusty merchandise, even my shoes. I'd have to ask Weston about that tomorrow. Or not ask. Weston didn't seem like the asking type. The extinguishers were mostly clustered around the clothing booths. A lot of faded denim, moth-eaten sweaters, and plastic floral prints. The air here smelled strongly of cedar and something vaguely chemical, like old mothballs dissolving. I ran my hand along a rack of jackets, feeling the rough texture of the fabric. It was quiet, really quiet. Even the usual hum of the distant highway seemed muffled. Maybe the weather was changing. It had been muggy all day, but now there was a coolness in the air, a sort of damp stillness. I finished with the extinguishers and started to move towards the back, checking the emergency exits. I'd already done a full perimeter sweep, but I figured a second pass couldn't hurt. It wasn't like there was anything else to do. The phone hadn't rung since 11:30, which was a small mercy. I still jumped every time my radio crackled with static, though, and I still couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was forgetting something. Something important. It wasn't the extinguishers. It wasn't the exits. It was something to do with the document, I think. Some particular instruction that was slipping through my grasp. I was passing the main entrance, the section with the old furniture and antique lamps, when I heard someone call my name. Kieran? Kieran, is that you? I turned. Standing just inside the entrance, silhouetted against the dim parking lot lights, was a man I'd never seen before. He was wearing a heavy coat, even though it wasn't that cold, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He had a friendly smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hi," I said cautiously. "Well, hello there. Didn't expect to see you working the late shift. Last time I saw you, you were over at the hardware store, wasn't it? Helping old man Hemlock with his plumbing?" I frowned. I'd never worked at a hardware store. I'd never met this man in my life. But he was saying it with such confidence, such a casual familiarity. It was unnerving. A flicker of the document surfaced in my mind. Something about people, about recognizing people, about names. A rule. There was a rule about this. Something about not confirming things, about not agreeing, about pretending you didn't know them. It was probably just a case of mistaken identity. People look alike, especially in this light, especially after a long night. He probably just thought I was someone else. I could just smile politely and say, "You must have me confused with someone else." Simple, direct, no harm done. But that felt wrong, like acknowledging something that shouldn't be acknowledged, like inviting further interaction. "Oh, you're right," I said, forcing a chuckle. "It's been a while. I've been doing a bit of everything lately, trying to make ends meet." I kept my tone light, non-committal, lots of different jobs. He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "That's the spirit, always hustling. That's what I like to see. Listen, I was just wondering if you happen to see old Flora around. She usually sets up shop near the back, sells those crocheted doilies. Haven't seen her all night." Flora? I'd seen a woman named Flora earlier. She was setting up a booth near Section C with a lot of doilies. But that didn't matter. What mattered was this man, this impossible familiarity, and the nagging feeling that I was stepping into something I didn't understand. I remembered the document again, more clearly this time. Not the exact wording, but the feeling of the rule. It wasn't about politeness. It wasn't about avoiding awkwardness. It was about something else, about preventing something from gaining a foothold, about denying validity to a false connection. It was about not confirming anything. "No, sir," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Haven't seen anyone named Flora tonight. Just been making my rounds." His smile widened, but it still didn't reach his eyes. "That's a shame. Well, carry on then. Good to see you, Kieran." He turned and walked back into the darkness, disappearing into the maze of booths. I stood there for a moment, watching the spot where he'd been standing. My pulse felt fast, but not panicked, more like alert. I checked my watch. 1:17 a.m. Still a long night ahead. I felt a tightness in my chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the same feeling I'd had when I'd first read the document, the same feeling I'd had when the phone rang repeatedly, the same feeling I had when I'd concealed the yellow mug. I walked back towards Section B, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The smell of cedar and mothballs seemed stronger now, almost overpowering. I needed to get back to my rounds, needed to pretend everything was normal, needed to ignore the lingering feeling that something was profoundly, fundamentally wrong, and I needed to remember that I had a yellow mug hidden in my backpack. A bright, ridiculous sunshine yellow mug, and that somehow that felt like the least of my worries. I made a note to check the security cameras first thing in the morning, see if they'd captured anything of that man. Not because I expected to find anything useful, but because it felt like something I should do. Like a small act of defiance against the unsettling weight of the night. It wouldn't change anything, of course, but it would be something. I was checking the fire extinguishers. It wasn't a scheduled thing. Not exactly, but it felt right. Methodical. Something to occupy the time. Each one had a pressure gauge, a little needle pointing into a green zone. I tapped each one, listening for a hollow sound. They all seemed okay. Section A was mostly antique furniture, a lot of old wood and upholstery, so the extinguishers felt particularly important there. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight. The air smelled like beeswax and old paper. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in on you, makes your ears ring. I hadn't seen anyone for 2 hours, not a soul. Just the endless rows of booths, shrouded in darkness. I was nearing the end of Section A, past the chipped porcelain dolls and the stacks of vinyl records, when I heard it. "It's too cold in here." The voice was thin and reedy. It came from booth A-17, a small space crammed with vintage clothing. I'd seen the woman who ran it earlier, Dora, I think her name was. A small, wiry woman with a permanent frown. She'd been meticulously arranging a display of scarves. "Excuse me?" I said, shining my light in her direction. She hadn't looked up. "It's too cold in here," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't meet my eye, just kept fiddling with a silk scarf, smoothing out the wrinkles. I checked the thermostat on the wall nearby. 68 degrees, not ideal maybe, but not freezing. People complained about the temperature all the time, especially in these old buildings. Old bones, I figured. I glanced at Dora again. She was still arranging the scarves, her movements jerky and precise. "I can adjust the thermostat if you'd like," I offered, keeping my voice neutral. "But it's set to 68 right now." "It's too cold in here," she said a third time. The exact same words, the same flat tone. It wasn't a request, not really. It was a statement, a repetition. A prickle of something unpleasant ran down my spine. I remembered the document, the pages filled with those strange prohibitions. Something about complaints, not general dissatisfaction, but specific, identical complaints. A message the document had implied. Someone listening. I couldn't recall the exact wording. Something about escalating. Not handling it myself. It was a clumsy recollection, a half-formed impression dredged up from the depths of a sleepless night. I told myself it was a coincidence. The woman was just cold, old, eccentric. Maybe she had a medical condition. Maybe I was letting this whole thing get to me. The late hours, the pressure with Sarah's bills, the weirdness of the place. It was all building up. I needed to breathe. I needed to stop overthinking. But the image of that man, the one who knew my name, flashed in my mind, and the tightness in my chest returned. I pulled out my radio and called Weston. It felt wrong, like I was shirking my duty, like I should be able to handle a simple complaint about the temperature. But the document, the insistent feeling that something was off, it was stronger than my reluctance. "Weston here." His voice crackled over the radio. Hi Weston, it's Kieran. I've got a situation in Section A. A vendor, Dora, is repeatedly complaining that it's too cold. She's said it 3 times now, exactly the same way. I think I need to escalate this." There was a pause, a long drawn-out pause. Then Weston's voice, calm and even. "Good work, Kieran. That's exactly what you should do. Don't engage further. Just document the complaint, time and location, and I'll handle it. Okay, I said, my voice sounding small and uncertain. But is everything all right? Everything is fine, Kieran. Just follow procedure. And remember, don't deviate from the instructions. He didn't elaborate. He didn't offer any reassurance. He just repeated the mantra, follow procedure. I wrote down the time, 2:47 a.m., and the booth number in my notepad. Dora hadn't moved. She was still arranging those scarves, her back to me. I wanted to ask her if she was okay, if she needed a blanket, if there was anything I could do. But I couldn't. The rule, fragmented and insistent in my memory, held me back. I walked away from Section A, and as I did, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small antique music box on Dora's counter. It was intricately carved, with tiny figures dancing around a miniature carousel. It wasn't playing, but I could swear I'd seen the carousel slowly rotating when I'd first walked past. Now, it was still. I had promised Sarah I would pick up her medication on my way home. It was a new prescription, a different dosage, and she'd been anxious all day about getting it filled. I'd planned to swing by the pharmacy before my shift, but then Weston had called about a minor issue with the back gate, and it had gotten late. I'd told Sarah I'd get it first thing in the morning, but now, looking at the empty rows of booths, the feeling of being watched pressing in on me, I knew that wouldn't be good enough. I'd promised Sarah, and right now, keeping that promise felt more important than anything. But I couldn't leave. Not now. Not with Weston expecting a full report. Not with Dora still silently arranging those scarves. The medication would have to wait. I was checking the fire extinguishers. It wasn't a scheduled thing. Not exactly. Weston hadn't mentioned it, but it felt like something you just did. This place was full of old wood and flammable junk. Section C, the back corner with the antique furniture, was particularly bad. Dust motes hung thick in the air. Even with the ventilation running, I pulled the pin on the first one, gave it a quick test burst, a pathetic little puff of white, and then reset it. Each one was the same, half empty, probably expired, but technically present. The extinguishers were all painted a sickly green, the kind of shade that always felt wrong, like someone had mixed the colors incorrectly. It reminded me of the hospital waiting room, that same institutional green. Sarah hated that color, said it smelled like regret. I hadn't thought about that in a while. She'd been more practical about the hospital, mostly focused on getting the bills paid. I moved on to the last extinguisher, tucked away behind a towering stack of chipped porcelain dolls. The air back there was different, still stale but heavier. I figured it was just the lack of circulation. The dolls were crammed together, faces pressed against each other, a silent, glassy-eyed audience. It always felt like they were watching me, but I chalked it up to being tired and spending too much time alone. I reached for the pin, my fingers brushing against the cool metal. And then it hit me. Not like a blast of air, but like absence. A hole in the air. I pulled my hand back instinctively. The temperature had dropped, and it wasn't a draft. There were no windows back there, no vents, nothing that could explain it. It was just cold, unnaturally, profoundly cold. I stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Old buildings settle, air pockets form. My breath probably just hadn't caught up to the temperature change. It had been warm out earlier, and the building was huge. It could take a while for the temperature to even out. I was probably just being paranoid. Weston's question from earlier echoed in my head. Have you noticed anything unusual? I'd said no. I'd stuck to the rules. Now I was seeing things, feeling things, or not seeing exactly, feeling the lack of something. I took a step closer to the doorway, intending to dismiss it completely. Just check the extinguisher, move on. But as I did, I saw my breath. Not a faint wisp, but a solid cloud, like I was in a freezer. I hadn't noticed it before, but the air around the doorway was visibly shimmering, distorting the shapes of the dolls behind it. That was not normal. It wasn't a settling building or a temperature gradient. A faint, high-pitched whine started, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. It wasn't mechanical, not exactly. It sounded organic, like the air itself was vibrating. I paused, my hand hovering over the extinguisher. A memory surfaced, something from the document, something about cold, Not drafts, but a specific kind of cold. A cold that meant something else. A cold that meant you didn't go in alone. Or at all. I didn't even think about Weston. I didn't think about the report I needed to finish. Didn't think about Sarah's medication. I just turned and started walking. Fast, away from Section C, away from the dolls, away from the cold. My boots echoed on the concrete floor, the sound abnormally loud in the stillness. I ended up in Section A, near Dora's booth. She was still there, arranging her scarves. She hadn't moved since I spoke to her about the temperature. I stopped a few feet away, catching my breath. "Dora?" I said, my voice sounding strained. She didn't look up. She just continued to arrange the scarves, her movements slow and deliberate. "Dora, it's really cold back in Section C?" Still no response. I hesitated. I shouldn't bother her. I'd already disturbed her once, and Weston had made it clear I wasn't to engage. But I couldn't shake the image of that shimmering cold the way my breath had crystallized in the air. Just checking," I mumbled, turning to leave. "Making sure everything's all right." As I walked away, I glanced back at her booth. She hadn't moved, but one of the scarves, a dark crimson one, had fallen to the floor. It lay there, a splash of color against the drab concrete, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, it looked like it was pulsating. I didn't stop to pick it up. I didn't look back again. I walked towards the front of the market, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio. I needed to tell Weston something, but I didn't know what, and I knew with a sickening certainty that whatever it was, it wouldn't be enough. I kept walking, the cold clinging to the back of my throat, and I knew I would be checking the fire extinguishers again, but not in Section C. Not ever in Section C. I was restocking the first aid kits. It was a pointless task, really. No one ever used them. Mostly just Band-Aids and antiseptic wipes gathering dust in those little plastic boxes. But Weston had put it on the checklist, so I did it. Every aisle got one, hung on those flimsy metal hooks near the emergency exits. Section A was the easiest, mostly sporting goods and old toys. People didn't tend to injure themselves browsing dusty baseball gloves. The fluorescent lights hummed, a high-pitched whine that never really went away. It got to you after a while, settled behind your eyes like a headache. I checked the expiration dates on the bandages, replaced a half-used bottle of hand sanitizer. It was almost 2:00 a.m. The market was quiet. The only sound was the hum and the occasional creak of the metal roof settling. I was starting to feel that familiar late-night fatigue, the kind that makes your eyelids heavy and your thoughts slow. I wished I could just sit down for 5 minutes, but I knew from experience that sitting down meant falling asleep. I finished Section A and moved on to Section B, housewares and furniture. This was the worst. Lots of narrow aisles, precarious stacks of chipped porcelain and wobbly chairs. I had to be careful not to knock anything over. I was opening the cabinet under one of the display tables, reaching for a fresh first aid kit, when I heard it. Breathing. Not my own. It was faint, raspy, like someone trying to breathe through a clogged nose. It came from the back of the room, from the space between the towering stacks of old dressers and moth-eaten sofas. The room was empty. I knew it was. I'd walked through here 15 minutes ago, double-checking for anything out of place. Nothing. No one. My own breath hitched. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you think someone is watching you. I forced myself to take a deep breath, then another, slow, even breaths. I remembered something from the document, something about not reacting, about not acknowledging. If you heard something, you just kept breathing, kept moving. It was probably just the building settling. Old wood creaking, air moving through the vents, that had to be it. This place was falling apart. It wouldn't be surprising if it made noises. It was a ridiculous thought. But I clung to it. A draft, an old pipe, anything but something else. I reminded myself of the medical bills, of Sarah, of the need to just get through this shift. I continued to breathe deliberately, consciously regulating the rise and fall of my chest. In, out, in, out. It felt unnatural, forced, like I was trying to convince myself I wasn't scared. And the breathing continued, a slow, ragged rasp that seemed to be getting closer. I began to walk, slowly, deliberately, towards the back of the room, keeping my breathing steady. Each step felt heavy, my legs leaden. I told myself I was just going to check, to confirm it was nothing. To prove to myself that I was being ridiculous. As I rounded the corner of a particularly large armoire, I saw it. Or, rather, I almost saw it. In the space between the furniture, where the shadows were deepest, there was a distortion in the air, like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day, but colder. A shimmering, wavering effect. It wasn't a shape, not exactly. More like a displacement. It was there for a fraction of a second, then gone. I kept walking, maintaining my pace, my breathing steady. I didn't look back, didn't speed up, just kept walking towards the exit of Section B, towards the relative safety of the main aisle. The breathing faded as I moved away, becoming indistinguishable from the hum of the lights and the creaks of the building. By the time I reached the entrance to Section C, I was drenched in a cold sweat. My shirt stuck to my back. I didn't slow down, didn't even glance towards that section. I remembered the cold, the unnatural chill I'd felt there. Weston hadn't seemed concerned, but I wasn't going back. Not even to check. I finished restocking the first aid kits in Section D, then moved on to Section E. I worked mechanically, my mind racing. It had been a trick of the light, I told myself. Just exhaustion and shadows. But the image of that distortion, that wavering in the air, kept replaying in my mind. It hadn't been a shadow. It had been something bending the light. I found myself avoiding looking into the darker corners of the aisles, scanning the periphery of my vision. The radio crackled, but I didn't bother checking if it was Weston. I didn't want to talk, didn't want to have to say no again. When my break finally came around, I didn't go to the break room. I stayed near the front entrance, watching the empty parking lot. I needed to be where I could get out quickly if I needed to. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something had shifted. It wasn't just the cold in Section C, or the man who knew my name. It was something else, something connected to that breathing, to that distortion. I pulled out my phone, intending to call Sarah, but instead of dialing her number, I opened the Notes app, and I started to write. Not about what I'd seen, not exactly, just a description of the room, the furniture, the shadows, the precise location where I'd heard the breathing, a list of what I could remember. It was a stupid thing to do, I knew, it wouldn't help, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. It was like I was trying to pin down the feeling, to solidify it before it dissolved completely. I wrote until my fingers ached, until the screen glowed with a long, rambling account of an empty room. And then, I closed the app, and I waited for my break to end. I was counting the light bulbs in Section A. It wasn't a security thing, not really, just something to do. Old fluorescent tubes, mostly buzzing and flickering, the kind that make your teeth ache if you stare at them too long. There were 73. I'd gotten to 73 before I realized how ridiculous it was. 73 light bulbs. I was getting paid to walk around a mostly empty flea market and count light bulbs. Sarah would laugh. She'd say, "You're officially losing it, Kieran." The air in Section A was thick with the smell of dust and mothballs. A lot of the stalls sold vintage clothes, or at least clothes that looked vintage, mostly just smelled old. I checked the lock on the main gate, then double-checked it. It felt solid enough. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the corrugated metal roof. Another Friday night, another 8 hours. I thought about Sarah, about her appointment with Dr. Klein tomorrow, the new medication, hoping it would finally do something. I moved on to Section B, checking for signs of forced entry. Nothing. Everything was as it should be. A jumble of mismatched furniture, chipped porcelain dolls, boxes overflowing with old vinyl records, the usual. I tried not to think about the breathing. It had been almost 2 hours since I'd heard it, but the memory of that ragged rasp still prickled at the back of my neck. Just the building settling, I kept telling myself. Old pipes, shifting foundations. I reached the back of Section B, near the storage room. And that's when I saw it. The door to the basement, it wasn't closed all the way. Just ajar, maybe an inch. I hadn't paid attention to it before. The basement wasn't part of my usual route. No vendors down there, just storage, Weston had said. Old inventory, broken furniture, stuff nobody wanted to bother with. Still, it should have been locked. For a second, I just stood there, staring at the gap in the door. It felt wrong. Not immediately terrifying, but wrong. Like a discordant note in a familiar song. I glanced around, half expecting to see Weston, to realize this was some kind of test, but the aisle was empty. Just me and the flickering fluorescent lights. I briefly considered going back to the front, calling Weston, asking if he'd unlocked it for some reason. But then I remembered the document. The one Cal had handed me, without a word, the one with all the instructions. I remembered a phrase fuzzy around the edges, something about a door, a basement door. If it was unlocked, lock it, don't open it, log it. That was it. That was all I could recall, the words slippery and indistinct. It struck me as absurd. A basement door. What could possibly be down there? Probably just rats. Or maybe more of Dora's discarded merchandise. She'd been throwing out boxes of broken jewelry all week. Still, the feeling persisted, that nagging sense of wrongness. Maybe it was just the exhaustion. Maybe I was starting to see things. I walked over to the door and pushed it closed. It swung shut with a soft click. I reached for the padlock, my hands surprisingly steady. It wasn't a heavy padlock, just a simple brass one. I secured it, the metal cool and smooth against my skin. It felt satisfying somehow, like I'd fixed something, like I'd averted a problem. Then I took out my notepad and wrote, "Basement door found unlocked. Secured at 1:47 a.m. Just the facts. No embellishment, no speculation, just the facts." I closed the notepad and tucked it back into my pocket. I scanned the aisle one last time, then moved on to section C, consciously avoiding looking back at the basement door. As I walked, I noticed the radio was on again, static hissing from the speaker. Weston wasn't responding to my calls. I thought about the breathing and the cold spot. And the man who knew my name, and the yellow mug still sitting on my desk at home. Everything felt connected. Not in a logical way, but in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was like each strange occurrence had added a layer to something, building towards something I couldn't quite define. I reached the entrance to section C and paused. The cold was still there, a noticeable drop in temperature. I didn't go in, I didn't even look. I just kept walking, towards the front of the market, towards the relative safety of the entrance. The air felt heavier now, thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Not from section C, not from the basement, but from somewhere else, somewhere unseen, somewhere waiting. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that whatever it wasn't upstairs anymore. The clock above the front desk ticked over to 6 a.m. Weston was already there, leaning against the counter, nursing a chipped mug. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just nodded towards the time card. I punched out. The machine spat out a flimsy slip of paper. It felt anticlimactic. All that for a piece of paper. "Everything quiet?" Weston asked, still not meeting my eyes. "Yeah," I said. "Quiet." It was the easiest answer. The truest, in a way. Nothing happened, not in a way I could explain to him or to anyone. Just a series of things. A cold spot, a locked door, a ringing phone, a man who knew my name. I'd told him everything was fine, hadn't I? I'd denied everything. It was probably just stress, long hours, an old building, the medical bills. That had to be it. A man could start seeing things when he was staring down the barrel of $50,000 in debt. He grunted, took a sip from his mug. Good. Cal's been off since he retired. He said he kept hearing things. He thought he was losing it. Turns out he was. He said it like it was a joke, but his face didn't move. I handed him the logbook. He barely glanced at it, just flipped to the last entry, basement door found unlocked, secured at 1:47 a.m., and scribbled his initials beside it. No comment, no questions, just a quick scribble, and then he was already turning the page, prepping for the next shift. I suddenly felt a strong urge to ask him about Cal, about what Cal had heard, but I didn't. I just didn't. It wasn't that I was afraid of the answer. It was that I didn't want to open that door again. The drive home was gray and drizzly. I didn't turn on the radio. I just kept the headlights on and focused on the road. I needed to call Sarah. It was 10 o'clock. Her treatment schedule hadn't changed. I pulled into a gas station, killed the engine, and dialed her number. She sounded tired, but relieved to hear my voice. We talked for 20 minutes, about the doctor's appointment, about the new medication, about the bills. I told her everything was fine at work. I didn't mention the basement door, or the cold, or the breathing, just the usual. I started noticing things after that. Small things. The way shadows fell in the corners of the room. The silence after the phone stopped ringing. The way people's faces seemed indistinct, like they weren't quite fully formed. I started checking the locks on the apartment door, multiple times a night. I found myself scanning the street outside, looking for I didn't know what, just something. I'd always enjoyed making coffee in the morning, the ritual of grinding the beans, the smell of it brewing. I had a bright yellow mug, a silly thing I'd picked up on a whim at a roadside diner. It always made me smile, but now I couldn't bring myself to use it. It sat in the cupboard, unused, gathering dust. Every time I reached for a mug, my hand would instinctively bypass it, choosing one of the plain white ceramic ones instead. I didn't decide to stop using it, it just felt wrong. I applied for a different job last week. Something in a warehouse, loading and unloading trucks. The pay was barely any better, but it was during normal hours. I didn't mention the flea market in my interview. I just said I was looking for a change of pace. They hired me. I start next Monday. This morning, I drove past the flea market on my way to the grocery store. The parking lot was empty, the gates closed. A new sign was posted on the front door. Now hiring, overnight security. The handwriting on the sign was identical to Weston's. It was the same chipped mug he'd been drinking from. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, towards the grocery store, towards a life that felt almost normal. But I couldn't shake the image of that yellow mug, sitting alone in the dark. And I knew, somehow, that the silence wouldn't last.